I've got another one for you guys. I've got another film that definitely deserves to be a highlight of another episode of Rotten Reviews. On this episode, I take a look at the 2018 film Mortal Engines, and it has a 27% on the tomato meter and a 50% on the audience score. It's certainly rotten, and I had trouble just sitting through this whole thing because despite the fantastic visuals, the fantastic CGI effects, the fantastic and really try-hard score, I just found it very bloated, very long, very drawn out, and you know, when I got to the end of this, I was just hoping that it would finally finish, that somebody would finally die, and the story would finally end, but it just kept going on, and I'm going to agree and say that this film deserves to be rotten. 50% on the audience score, it could even be lower. I would consider even a 40% on the audience score to be perfectly fair. 27% on the critics, on the tomato meter. Yeah, that's about right, because despite what must have been a massive budget and the involvement of Peter Jackson, who directed the Lord of the Rings films, he was actually credited as the main writer of this. It's a complete fail, and I can tell just by watching this that it must have been a financial failure as well. And the first clue I had was that this only has 3,778 audience reviews as of December of 2019. So in 1 year, less than 4,000 people have actually bothered to put a review, pro or con, on Rotten Tomatoes. That's a big warning sign right off the bat. But let's get into the Rotten reviews, and I will read only 3-star and fewer star reviews because I think that's the best way to learn how this movie failed. And I've made quite a number of notes I've jotted down while watching this, and so if the audience reviews forget something, I'll certainly add my own notes. And let's move right down here on page number 1, December 18, 2019, 2 stars. It's just a shame in how Peter Jackson doesn't bring the same energy like The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. He should be directing this thing. Well, he's probably glad he didn't direct this, that he only is associated as the writer. That's my feeling on it, because I think that this felt like something he would have done, but since he's only credited as being the writer, he can kind of get away from the negative publicity, if this even has any publicity, because like I said, less than 4,000 audience reviews. It's like this film was just completely forgotten, and until I saw this running on HBO, I had also completely forgotten that this existed. If I had to give it a star review, I would say 1 star, maybe 1.5 stars at the maximum. It just has too many problems, and it can't just be carried on visual effects alone. The visual effects are quite nice to look at, and they're very helpful to keep you viewing and interested at the beginning, but it's not enough. After about 30 minutes of seeing these magnificent visuals, it gets old, and you find out there's just no story here, and there's just far too much boredom. But yeah, I'll say 1.5 stars max, and Peter Jackson should be grateful that he can kind of have people forget that he was involved. But let's continue on. December 17, 0.5 star. Terrible, couldn't get involved with it at all, nothing fetching about it. I disagree, the visuals are fetching, but not enough to carry the film. The whole premise of it is very bizarre, but still interesting, as crazy as it is to explain, and I'm going to explain it very simply. It's a post-apocalyptic future in which our modern world, I guess it progressed on until the 22nd century, and then we used some kind of quantum nuclear weapon on each other, wiped out civilization, and then 1,000 years later, in this post-apocalyptic world, the remaining cities are like traveling cities. The cities have been loaded into these mechanized platforms with tank treads that kind of move about across the altered landscape. And the city of London is actually one of these mobile cities that's on gigantic tank treads. And for some reason, it needs to drive around across some kind of land bridge into Europe. And it's scavenging steel. It looks like it's just basically scavenging steel and old parts from other land-based city encampments, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The film kind of shows you that for some reason scrap steel is really valuable and it's almost used as some kind of energy source. I know that's probably not what's supposed to be going on, but the film doesn't really give you enough information to draw another conclusion. I know this is a story that came from a novel, some kind of fantasy novel, and I'm pretty certain that in a fantasy novel this would have been explained better. But in the film, it's just shown to us that like the city of London is on tank treads, and it's got like old parts of London loaded on top of it, along with some cyberpunk and steampunk type of dwellings. And it's fed by some kind of giant furnace that consumes scrap metal and whatever else. And it doesn't really explain how this is energy efficient or why it's more efficient to have the city of London be a mobile thing rather than just, conserve energy and resources and just stay in one spot. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but as a fantasy story, you can kind of hand wave that initial thing away. But the problem is this film also has a lot of other ridiculous, non-believable aspects to it, too many to work. And whereas in a fantasy movie you can hand wave away one particular thing, you can't just do that with every single thing in the plot. It becomes ridiculous, and that's what happened to this movie. So yeah, it's a very ridiculous premise. These mobile cities are moving around what is shown to be Europe and Asia, and the city of London, it's filled with, it's got rich people, it's got poor people, but basically it's a whole lot of people that chug beer and watch as their city kind of scavenges and ruins the lives of other people across Europe. And it's kind of weird. On one hand, they want us to sympathize with the people in the city of London, but they actually show the city of Londoners as pretty much villains, and their leader, who turns out to be irredeemably evil as the movie progresses, their leader has decided that he needs to bring down this wall that's there's this giant wall that's got Europe walled off from Asia, from some kind of Asian society they protected themselves behind this giant wall. And behind this giant wall, they're living in a type of utopian paradise. That's what the movie shows. And it's somewhere in Asia, and their leader is some kind of Tibetan monk-looking figure. And they're, I guess, the good guys, and the bad guys are the British people in the city of London that are just bloodthirsty and beer thirsty and want to destroy and get into this Asian nation behind this wall and just like rape and pillage it, I guess. And basically they're the bad guys that they're showing us that we're supposed to sympathize with in this film. And that's why I say this film feels to me like it was made for the Asian market, like maybe this was supposed to do big box office in China, because the themes, even the way this movie ends, it leaves you with the theme that the Asian culture is somehow the utopian good guy culture, and they're the wise ones, and the Western culture represented by the city of London they're the bad guys. They're basically consumed with pillaging and drinking beer, and they cheer at every conquest, and they're just ruining a whole lot of things and ruining the environment as they, have their tank tread city go all over the countryside. That's where this movie ends up. If there's a message to be taken away, it's that Westerners are bad guys and Asians are good guys. It's very obvious all through the movie, but it's completely obvious in the ending. And at the end, I actually was cheering. I wanted to see the Londoners just exterminated. I mean, they had done such a good job of making them into the bad guys that I wanted to see them just like cut down by machine gun fire at the end, just slaughtered. If this movie had ended with the population of the city of London just being slaughtered by machine gun fire on this wall, it would have been a satisfying ending to me, because these people were built up as bloodthirsty, like just irredeemable people. And unfortunately, that's not what happened. The movie ended with the Asian leader taking pity on the city of Londoners, and after their city was destroyed, failing to breach this wall, the Asians just decide to take them in as innocent refugees. And so it's kind of hard to go along with that. It's almost infuriating as an audience member, because you're watching these Londoners just become like callous savages against everybody else that's not on their side. And then at the last minute, at the ending, you're supposed to pity them as poor refugees. It just doesn't work. I wanted to see them slaughtered. It's another reason. There's a lot of things that just don't work with this, but to me, it's like this was designed for the Asian market to be big in China. I don't know if it was. Maybe it was. Maybe it made all its money in China, because I barely heard of this thing in the United States, and I'm pretty up on movies coming out. And this was a recent one from 2018, and I had completely not heard of this on its theatrical release. I wasn't even aware it was in the theater. Like I said, I just found out about this when it showed up on cable channels, satellite channels. So who knows, maybe this made a lot of money in Asia, but according to Rotten Tomatoes, there's no there's no box office revenue listed on this movie. Some movies don't have that listed. I'm sure I could find the numbers out there somewhere, but that's not the purpose of a Rotten review. I'm just going to say that I think this was probably a lot more popular in China. So let's move on. Let's see, we have 4-star reviews. I'm not going to read those. This is not a 4-star movie. It's got way too many problems. 3 stars, November 15. Not as bad as people make out. Really? Not as bad as people make out? Okay, I'm just going to go right into my list. Yeah, right off the bat, right from the beginning of this thing, there's like an opening narration that kind of tries to bring the audience up to speed on the background of, your setting and whatnot. And the voice of the opening narration is so gravelly and hard to understand that I had to almost rewind it and watch it twice to get all the words from it. You better have your volume nice and crisp and clear and loud on your TV set or whatever you're using to watch this on, because you're not going to hardly make out what the narrator is saying, because as it turns out, the opening narrator, and I don't know why they chose to do this, the opening narrator, the voice, it comes from a character in the film that's basically a rip-off of a Terminator unit. And yes, this film has ripped off a lot of different things. It's got a rip-off of the Terminator in it. It's a Terminator built out of part human and part cyborg parts. And it's basically straight out of the Terminator, but it has glowing green eyes instead of red eyes. I don't want to get too deep into the plot on how it works in the plot, but it's actually this Terminator villain creature that is used, its voice is used for the opening narration, and I have no idea why, because it doesn't figure into the plot strong enough to be a narrator for anything. It's very strange. It's another really weird part of this movie, but as the movie opens, you don't know who this voice, what the source of this voice is, but it's a very gravelly and off-putting voice, and I'm just like, why did they choose this particular voice as the opening narrator? It's completely weird. So that's right in the opening seconds of the film before I've even seen anything visually. I'm kind of cringing over that. So that's a big fail. So you can't tell me that this isn't as bad as people say when, I haven't even seen anything in the film and I'm already having a cringe reaction. So let's move on. 3 stars, November 14, 2019. With Peter Jackson leading the way, I had high expectations coming into this movie. In the end, I think that was Mortal Engine's downfall. Although not by much, this movie would have been better received with a newcomer at the helm. Entertaining at times, the movie never really gets the blood flowing like it could have. However, the world building is absolutely brilliant. Yeah, they put a lot of money into this. This is not a low-budget film. This is a high-budget production. That's why I'm saying if it didn't make a lot of money in China, this took a huge financial loss, because the money just to set up the world, all the visual effects required, there's nothing cheap about it. Even the interiors of the traveling city of London and etc. were very well done, very expensive. None of this felt cheap at all. None of it looked cheap, even in the slightest. They spared no expense. There's no question about that. So this must have been very expensive to produce, and man, it must have really hauled in box office in China, or it took a serious financial loss. Let's move down 2 stars, November 5, 2019. More failed young adult. So this is a universe where the apocalypse only took an hour to alter the entire world. It's not really clear why, but the cities and towns now roam the countryside, with the biggest metropolises ingesting the smaller villages for fuel. Sounds crazy, right? Well, that is only a small part of the equation, because there are two young people with romantic tension, a tyrannical leader, a conspiracy, and a whole lot of familiar tropes. Now, when it comes to young adult franchises, let's face it, yeah, it is like, you can tell it's a young adult novel of some type. If it's not, then the novel failed too, because in the first 5 minutes I could tell this was a young adult fantasy of some type, because all your main characters look very young. They look almost too young to even be in the roles and the positions they're in inside their society. And that's a big fail on all young adult films. I don't know about the novels, I don't read them, but you'll notice that in almost every young adult fantasy or sci-fi work that's a film, you have leaders that in our society would always be over the age of 40, certainly over the age of 35. But in these fantasy young adult worlds, you know, they're barely old enough to drink, and yet they're leaders and architects and engineers, and they're all in these high positions, and it's completely stupid and ridiculous and unbelievable. Now, that's something that you see in almost every young adult movie, but this movie has that flaw too. But if you just excuse that because of its genre, then it's overlookable. In fact, I didn't have that on my list as a flaw, because you see that in almost every young adult thing, so I kind of gave that a pass. But this is nowhere near the only problem with this film, that's for sure. Moving on, half a star from November 3rd. Terrible movie, beautifully made, but contains all the cliches and even more. Yeah, it straight up rips off Terminator. It kind of rips off The Matrix a little bit. It has fight scenes that are, you know, they should have been spectacular, but they just came across as boring and cliched and taken out of different films. And there are a couple of actors or actresses that are kind of miscast, and there's a particular Asian actress that features largely in the plot in this film, and I found her acting to be very wooden and very off-putting. It didn't fit with what was going on. I don't know if the actress is bad or if it's just the way the script had her in her role, but regardless, at least one of these main characters were miscast or just very wooden and bad and not convincing. And the romance between the two lead characters, that there has to be a romance, right? It's a young adult story. The romance isn't really convincing. You can see it coming from a million miles away, and it's cliched in every way, and it's just not convincing, and there's nothing believable about it, and it's not much of a romance. It's more like a platonic romance. There's no actual physical romance to it. It's very it's very teenage, but very, you know, barely teenage, like it's maybe a 12 to a 13-year-old teenage type romance. Just a waste of time, in my opinion. 2.5 stars, November 2nd, 2019. Basically, this is the antithesis of The Hobbit. As where Hawkeye was at least a movie and a half worth of material stretched out across 3 films, Engines is easily 2 movies condensed into one. In doing so, character and story development is severely weakened to the point that you just don't care what happens to anyone on screen. Its other great failing are some lackluster performances. That being said, goddamn, this movie looks gorgeous. The final battle scene is a fantasy fan's wet dream. Yes, I almost all the way agree with that review. The visuals are fantastic, particularly the final big battle at the end. It looks fantastic. It's just you don't give a shit what's going on. You really don't, just like this reviewer says. It's so beautiful to look at, but you just don't care, because the characters haven't convinced you that you know, that they're going to die. Nobody ever does. Even when they're in positions that they should die, they somehow walk away with barely a scratch. It's like, I don't know if they're just trying to keep the rating, or they're trying to appease the sensitive Chinese market, but there's really no blood or death in this, although there should be. And you just don't care. By the end, it's just so visually spectacular, but you're just the whole time almost wanting to look at your watch, because you just don't care. It doesn't feel like there's any suspense or any stakes in it at all. I completely agree. The fact that, yeah, there's just too much stuff in here. It could have been two movies crammed into one, but it didn't feel like that to me. It felt like all one story, but they just had too many weird elements thrown together and not enough time to make them all work. There's barely any downtime or breathing room between different things that they throw into this, so you just don't have time to process it much. There's just so many things thrown together here, and you barely have time to consider it for a moment before it just throws something else in there. And it's just shamelessly ripped off of Terminator, Matrix, Sky Captain, and the World of Tomorrow. I mean, there's so many movies that you can see little parts of it that have been jammed in, clearly taken from these other films. That's why the whole thing just feels like a greatest hits compilation of the last 15, 20 years of these type of films. Let's move on. 1.5 stars, October 28. Initially, I dismissed this movie entirely because of the title's similarity to The Mortal Instruments, some Twilight knockoff that got bad reviews and was only fit to be seen by teenagers. I was wrong. I should have dismissed it because it's not good and is fit to be seen by pretty much nobody. I kind of feel bad saying that because it tries, it really tries. But this is a story that requires too much world building in too little time and is filled with poorly established characters who have poorly written dialogue. Yeah, I almost entirely agree with all that too. There's just too much and not too much stuff in too short of a running time. And the running time is not short. It is a 2-hour movie, but or very close to it. But there's just even too much to, even if you had 3 hours, it's too much stuff thrown in here. You can barely take a breath between all the different weird stuff going on. And at the same time, it's just so beautiful to look at. You know, it wasn't cheap in any regard. But right off the top of my list, yeah, there's weird plot holes all through it. You know, the movie moves really fast through the plot, but there are so many plot holes that I caught 3 or 4 big ones, you know, on one viewing. And for example, at the beginning of this, the whole story can't start. The whole story only starts basically because the security that should be top notch for this city, that's this mobile city, should have all this top-notch security at its port of entry, but it doesn't. The security is really crappy, and it's really crappy because it has to be to make the plot go forward. And there's other stuff like that, stuff that's just a logical fail because the plot needs it to go forward. For example, not only is the security really shitty in a city that should have high security, but later when this Terminator-like character shows up, it is shown that the Terminator character, he can cover vast distances in very quick order. He moves lightning fast. He's a machine after all. Basically a T-800 type Terminator, but better, with glowing green eyes. But when the plot needs him to, when he's close to killing somebody and actually hurting somebody, one of our main characters, we can't have somebody actually be killed by him or really hurt by him. So he all of a sudden moves really slow and takes his time and even talks a little bit too much instead of just doing what he said he was going to do and just killing the person he's trying to kill. Nope, he has to all of a sudden slow down and walk slowly towards them so that somebody has a chance to stop him. It's really stupid, and it's just a complete fail. And the movie does too much of that. Too many times people should be dead or at least injured, and there's just some contrived dumb way why they're not, or it's just hand waved away and they get away with barely a scratch. Again, I think that might have something to do with appealing to the Chinese market. They have really strict rules about what kind of deaths can happen and how much blood can be shown, and etc. I think that had something to do with it, but let's move on. October 27, 1 star. What a stinker. The engine-based towns and cities are pretty cool for about 30 seconds. The characters are mostly soulless and annoying. A great idea that was somehow ruined. Yeah, and Hugo Weaving's villain, you know, he's the only actor I'm going to list, Hugo Weaving. You know him as Agent Smith in The Matrix, and he was also in Lord of the Rings, right? But I'm only naming him, and I'm not naming any of the other actors or actresses for the reason that the rest of them are unknown to me. I consider them irrelevant. If they have careers somewhere out there, I'm not aware of them, so to me they're just forgettable, and I don't recall seeing them anywhere else. And so if I have to refer to them, I'll just refer to them by their description. So you can pretty much say this is a Hugo Weaving movie because he's the only recognizable actor in here to most Americans that would be sitting in the theater when this was released. And his villain, Hugo Weaving's villain, it's over the top evil just for the sake. I mean, he starts out like kind of well characterized, but then he progressively becomes more and more evil and crazed and more evil and crazed because the plot needs him to be that way. And he's even willing to sacrifice every other person in this and mass murder everybody to just to invade this Asian fortress, to breach this wall. And he's just a madman at the end, and he gets crushed and dispatched in the way that such a villain should be. But again, there's no blood or anything, and it's kind of a real letdown the way he's killed at the end. It's just a real big fail. 2 stars, October 20, great effects, but the story was off a lot. Yeah, that's pretty much right on. 1 star, October 19. White adults are the villains. Yet again, it's heavy with some decent CGI, but the story is a disappointing mess. Yeah, white adults are the villains. But more than that, the theme actually is that Westerners are the villains. Where I guess the basic theme, there's no mistaking it. It's not an accident. The whole theme of this movie is that Western society is comprised of pillagers that just rape the environment and scavenge, the earth, and we're irredeemable villains. And Asian culture is like in harmony with nature and wise and benevolent and more sophisticated, and you get the idea. There's no question that that's the theme of this movie, and maybe that really played well in China. I don't know, but it's so heavy-handed, so heavy-handed in this. Half a star, October 18. Let's make a movie that cities eat other cities. Argument, let's make a collage with themes of other movies that we have watched, mostly Star Wars, Mortal Engines. Yeah, it rips stuff off from Star Wars, and I was going to bring up an interesting tidbit too. It's very like Star Wars in the battle sequence because at one point they are attacking the city of London from aerial vehicles, and much like Star Wars, where the Star Destroyers and etc. are covered with anti-aircraft turrets of different types, and they're automated and they have all this firepower. These turrets, they can never quite seem to hit anything. They fire a lot and they're automated and everything, but they just can't quite kill anybody or actually hit any targets. And that's very much like Star Wars, and it feels like Star Wars like that too at the end in that regard. It's completely dumb, and that's a failing of Star Wars too. I was going to compare this to The Last Jedi, where, the character of Poe in his X-Wing, he takes out all the turrets on a Star Destroyer by himself with one ship, and that's the kind of logic that is in this film as well. I compare it to, The Last Jedi, but this reviewer beat me to it, so bravo for him. Let's move on. October 14, 2019, 2 stars. This film is hilariously funny for all the wrong reasons. I disagree. There were a couple of attempts at one-liners, just a couple that kind of fell flat, but it's not goofy enough that you can laugh. Like if you were drinking when you watched this, it's not quite that funny. It could have been, but it wasn't. It was just written to be completely taken serious. It's not one of those films that you can enjoy laughing at it. It'd be nice, but no, it's unfortunately not one of those. Let's get back to my list really quick here. Yeah, the fights. There are fights with swords and etc. Kind of ripping off some of it from martial arts films, and it's just boring. There's nothing exciting about it. It's very stylistic. It's very visually nice to look at, but for fights, no. It's just maybe only appealing to 6-year-olds. To an adult, it's very boring to watch these fights. I mentioned the Terminator ripoff. The Terminator isn't called the Terminator. He's called a resurrected man. And I guess at some point in the future, after the apocalypse, there's a group of people or scientists that decided they wanted to turn themselves into cyborgs. So they put their consciousness in, they basically wipe out half their consciousness and put what's left into Terminator T-800 type machines. Why, I don't know, and it features in the plot of this film, and it's completely stupid, and it's visually, it's nice to look at, but It's just one more mess of a thing ripped off from something else and put into this film. Um, yeah, the Asian actress, I don't know her name. She's very stylistic with stylistic hair and a red outfit and an Asian themed red floating spacecraft with jet engines and kind of oriental looking theme to it. It doesn't really, it's off-putting with everything else. It's like something taken out of an Asian martial arts film and then crammed into this thing. It doesn't feel like it belongs. And the Asian actress herself, she's very wooden, and she doesn't add anything to the plot. She's just distracting and wooden, very wooden, doesn't feel real. Let's see. Yeah, there's part of the plot where the main girl in this plot, she, at one point, she's so depressed that she just wants to become one of these resurrected people, or cyborg or Terminator type people. It doesn't make a lot of sense because the way they show this in the plot, you know, she would have been better off just killing herself, but no, she actually wanted to make herself into a Terminator and then backed out. And then after she backed out of that, the other Terminator that was taking care of her decided to go on a rampage and kill her. That was his whole reason for hunting her down to kill her, was because she wouldn't become a Terminator. Very weird, very weird. It's hard to explain. I know it sounds weird the way I'm explaining it, but believe me, it's just as weird in the film. It's not that I'm not understanding what's going on. I just told you what's going on, but it is that weird. Here's one from October 12th, 1 star. The concept to the world was great, but it was awful. Spent the last somewhat, I don't know what their number is here, something minutes waiting for this big signal. What was the point on the scene building that up? And the main character was awful and was just, I'm so edgy and I can't be happy. Then it's the end and she's actually happy. And I think they were trying to hint at love between her and the guy, which really wouldn't work. Yeah, like I said, there's a teenage romance thing going on here, but it doesn't go far enough to actually be romance, but it's there to appease the young adult Twilight crowd, I guess. And the girl, she's got a scarred face, otherwise she would be attractive, and they kind of play on that a little bit, like that she's the ugly duckling, and they kind of do a lot of things, but none of it really connects, and it feels very superficial and pointless, and yeah, it's just like young adult romance type stuff, but done in a boring way. I'm not a fan of young adult romance, but it's been done better in a lot of other things that I didn't like either, but at least the young adult romance part was done a lot better. In this film, it's just very wooden and superficial, and it's not convincing. Half a star, October 10, 2019. Maybe the worst movie I've ever seen. Probably worse than Geely. The plot was nonsense, the acting was horrendous, and the special effects looked like they were done using 1980s technology. Biggest waste of 2 hours ever. Well, I'll agree with most of that, but the CGI was not cheap. It didn't look cheap. It looked fantastic. I'm telling you, this reviewer is out to lunch. He's right on half a star. He's right about everything else. The acting was bad. A lot of the acting was bad. The plot was nonsensical, yes, but the CGI and the special effects looked fantastic. If you want to see good CGI, watch this movie, but you're going to get nothing else redeemable out of it. It becomes boring looking at really good CGI. Trust me, after a while, you get bored at the fantastic CGI, but it is fantastic and expensive CGI, no question. October 7, 3 stars. This movie was as bad as the critics made it out to be. Sure, it's no Lord of the Rings, but is it even possible to match the Lord of the Rings series? I found it entertaining, though. So they're saying that they're trying to say that you should forgive this because Peter Jackson is a part of it. I'm sorry, but he should run far away from this, and I'm sure he did, and that's why it only has 3,000 something audience reviews, so I completely disagree on that review. Here's one from October 2nd, 1 star. Wants to be Star Wars so bad. Yeah, it really does. You can almost draw an analogy between the main female character and Luke Skywalker's journey. They kind of do that, but they fail so hard at it that I can kind of see some rip-off stuff with Star Wars, but They didn't succeed enough with that for me to think it was a total ripoff of Star Wars. But as you've seen, more than one reviewer is saying that they felt that way. There's reasons for that. 1 star, September 23rd. Did anyone else think this movie was incredibly racist? Kind of, yeah. So the primary predator town was London, which had a black face here or there, but the diversity was not great, and the bad guy, who is white, wants to blow up the wall that is protecting a city of multi-ethnic people. But wait, it gets better. As the bad guy is using his weapon of mass destruction against the multi-ethnic town, the scene cuts to a group of all white people cheering and jeering, but then the camera pans to the one black guy. Yeah, okay, I think it's going a little too far to say that there's a racial message, but there's definitely a cultural message. They're trying to tell you that the Asian culture is enlightened and harmonic and in harmony with nature. And they've got the wise Buddhist monk-looking leader, whereas the Western culture, predominantly of white people, are savages, irredeemable scavengers, and rapists of everything that falls before them. That's where this movie actually went. To just say it's a racial thing, no, but the racial part is a part of that overall theme that I'm describing. So yeah, it fits in there. This movie was very heavy-handed like that. 2.5 stars, September 22nd, 2019. It felt choppy and rushed. For this reason, it was very limited in some character development. Overall, it had great potential, if not crammed into one movie. The story needed time to grow and breathe. Fail. Yeah, I largely agree. There's so much stuff in here, no time to take it all in. It just kept becoming more convoluted with more stuff, different elements that wouldn't normally be put together in one film, and it just didn't work. It just didn't work. 1.5 stars, September 21. About halfway through, I realized that there's no plot to this movie. Some cool visuals is about it. Couldn't take any more of it. Yeah, I sympathized with that. It had a plot, but it just overwhelmed you with so much on the visuals that you just kind of wondered what the point of it all was. It got boring to look at, so I agree. 2.5 stars, September 20. Despite some stunning and sometimes not so stunning visuals, this movie never lifts me up to really be enthralled into the setting and story. I think it was an amazing setting, but I miss it being drenched in lore. It could have used a dash of mystery, wonder, and soul. Well, I'll just say that this could have actually worked as a big fantasy novel, sure, all crammed into a 2-hour running time. Doesn't work. Let's go down to my list and find some flaws, shall we? Let me see here. Yes. There's a part of the movie where we're taken to a floating hydrogen balloon type city or base, and it's allied with the Asian culture, and our main heroes go there for kind of some downtime in the actual action. And you know what? At one part, the cybernetic Terminator model shows up, and he wrecks the place, and it catches on fire. And you know what happens when a fire spreads onto basically what is a big hydrogen-filled city? Yeah, it's going to explode, one big fireball, and it does eventually. But for the sake of the plot, it takes like maybe 5 to 10 minutes for this actual hydrogen balloon city, which is on fire, to actually combust and sink and explode into a ball of fire. And all the heroes and everybody get away in the nick of time, and it just drags on forever. This fight with this Terminator-like resurrected man on this hydrogen balloon city. And it's so stupid because you're thinking, when is this thing going to actually burn and explode? I mean, it is on fire and completely engulfed in flames for minute after minute after minute, but it doesn't finally explode and crash until everybody is safely on all their escape ships and the Terminator character's been dispatched, and it goes on for a while like this, and it's completely stupid. Maybe that works in China, but it didn't work for me. It was completely stupid. 2 stars, September 20. The idea was good, but the script screwed everything. Yeah, the idea could have worked in a fantasy novel. Maybe it did. But yeah, this script was just rotten to its core. So bad in so many ways. You're checking your watch, even though there's all this fantastic stuff going on. You're checking your watch to see, are we there yet? 2 stars, September 18th. Way too much going on. Definitely an interesting concept of moving cities, but the actual plot had very little to do with that. Had a few less characters. Had a few less characters been introduced and they took time to develop the main characters more, I think it would have been solid. Probably not worth the watch. Yeah, the characters are all very wooden. They go through their motions. Very flat, very uninteresting. When they do get a chance to sit down and talk to each other, it's completely boring. But thankfully, there's not much time where they actually get to sit down and talk. The action and the pace moves quite a lot on this, but it's still boring in almost every way, even when they're not talking. But yeah, the characters, I don't even remember their names. I really don't. By the time I got to the end credits, I don't remember any of the characters' names. 2 stars, simultaneous wow slash cringe. Also, stop using Hugo Weaving for unholy films. Yeah, Hugo Weaving will, for me, for people my age, he'll always be known as Agent Smith. It doesn't matter if he grows a beard. It doesn't matter if he puts on elf ears in Lord of the Rings. It doesn't matter what you do with him. He's always just going to be Agent Smith. And believe it or not, I have a feeling he's coming back as Agent Smith in the future Matrix 4 movie. There is a Matrix 4 coming. I already know. I can predict it's going to suck really bad. And I'm sure Hugo Weaving's got his Agent Smith role. So we've got that to look forward to, don't we? Let's just do a few more here. Half a star, September 14. This is the worst film I watched this year. The worst acting and screenplay, half a star. So once again, white men are pure evil, the West is bad, and the funniest part of it all, the East is the mecca of freedom and peace. Laugh my ass off. And Shrek was the dumbest subplot after Canto Bight. This movie went from a solid 10 to 0 in 60 minutes. Yeah, it is kind of ironic, isn't it, that they show China or the communist, what today is known as the place you go if you don't want any freedom in any regard. And in this post-apocalyptic future, China is the place you want to go for peace, tranquility, and freedom for all. It is kind of a fail on that one, isn't it? Unless this is made for the Chinese market, and then I guess the Chinese government is probably going to use this as some kind of official recruitment video. I don't know. Is this for Chinese tourism or something? I don't know. But it has the message that the Chinese way that's where your peace and tranquility on earth is going to be found, according to this film. 3 or 2.5 stars, September 7. Expecting the film to be a worldwide commercial success, Peter Jackson regrettably plastered his name all over this box office bomb because it employed much of his Lord of the Rings production team. Unfortunately, over the past decade, multiple mega hits have outshined all of Mortal Engine's dystopian adventure elements. The end result leaves us with the saute of high-tech rotating gear CGI that's too heavily overshadowed by its shop-worn plot. I'll largely agree with that. Yeah, and you can tell, man, Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings effects production team was on this. It shows. It looks fantastic. It's just too bad the rest of the film was crap because, wow, visually it was spectacular. 1 star, September 7. I was looking forward to watching this movie but fell asleep half an hour into it. Yeah, I could see that. I actually was standing up just for exercise while I watched this movie. If I had been sitting down in a comfy chair, kind of like I am now, I might have fallen asleep after 30 minutes. It's one of those type of movies. So there you have it. 50% on the audience score. It would be fair even at 40%. 27%, that's fair on the tomato meter. Just right off, you can tell when you look at the fact that it only has 3,778 audience reviews. There's a good reason for that. Probably because most people didn't even know this film existed, and there's probably a good reason for that. I'm guessing Peter Jackson doesn't want this to be more well-known. You know, it is what it is. I'm sure he made money off of it, but whoever fronted the money for this, well, my condolences, because I'm sure you took a loss. whoever invested in this thing. So anyway, I'm not going to go through the rest of my list and nitpick plot details, because it would just be hammering nails into a coffin that's already quite well buried. This thing is completely rotten, and I recommend not wasting your time unless you're doing a expose on special effects. Then it might be worth watching. But in any case, I will see you on the next episode of Rotten Reviews.